in truth, if the empirical philosopher had no other purpose in the establishment of his antithesis than to check the presumption of a reason which mistakes its true destination, which boasts of its insight and its knowledge, just where all insight and knowledge cease to exist, and regards that which is valid only in relation to a practical interest as an advancement of the speculative interests of the mind, in order, when it is convenient for itself, to break the thread of our physical investigations and, under pretense of extending our cognition, connect them with transcendental ideas, by means of which we really know only that we know nothing. If, I say, the empiricist rested satisfied with this benefit, the principle advanced by him would be a maxim recommending moderation in the pretensions of reason, and modesty in its affirmations, and at the same time would direct us to the right mode of extending the province of the understanding, by the help of the only true teacher, experience. In obedience to this advice, intellectual hypothesis and faith would not be called in aid of our practical interests, nor should we introduce them under the pompous title of science and insight. For speculative cognition cannot find an objective basis any other where than in experience, and when we overstep its limits, our synthesis, which requires ever new cognitions independent of experience, has no substratum of intuition upon which to build. But if, as often happens, empiricism in relation to ideas becomes itself dogmatic and boldly denies that which is above the sphere of its phenomenal cognition, it falls itself into the error of intemperance, an error which is here all the more reprehensible, as thereby the practical interest of reason receives an irreparable injury. Immanuel Kant. In my lecture on what is reason to Kant, I explained that according to him, reason is the faculty of principles, the faculty of thinking a priori, and that reason has this tendency or this desire towards the unconditional, towards the absolute. Reason wants to find, if there is a progress, if there's a succession of conditions and the conditioned, then reason wants to find the starting point. Reason wants to bring an end to it all by finding the one point, the one principle from which the whole succession, the whole chain is derived. And that is how reason gets to ideas, to concepts of reason that are concepts of something absolute. Well, and in the lecture on the dialectic, I explained how reason is, dialectical. Meaning, in Kant's terminology, meaning the doctrine of illusion. Meaning that when it comes to the ideas of reason, reason creates certain arguments that seem correct to us and that create a sort of illusion of truth, but that in fact are incorrect. And in the chapters on the dialectic and the critique of pure reason, Kant is trying to lift this illusion from us. And, after talking about the first idea of reason, the idea of the soul, I'm now getting to the second idea. The second idea would be that of the world. We have objects of perception, just like we ourselves are the subject, perceiving them, experiencing them, thinking them. And just like reason asks for an absolute subject that is the condition for, having representations of objects, and therefore comes to the idea of a soul, just like that, reason asks for the absolute object that is the condition for all objects that may appear to us. And that would be the world as the totality of the objects that we can experience. So that leads us to another field of metaphysics. I talked about what metaphysics is and what fields it has in its own lecture, but generally metaphysics to Kant is the core of philosophy, and it is the science of the supersensual. It is the science dealing with the ideas, and one of the fields of metaphysics is rational cosmology, so the doctrine of the world. The metaphysical study of the world. And you may think that unlike the ideas of the soul or of God, which are clearly supersensual things that we can't experience through our senses, that we can only think, you may think that unlike those, the world is not just an idea, not just a thought, but something you can actually experience. But Kant would say, no, what we have perceptions of are only things in the world, are only the things making up the world. But the world as a whole is outside of our sensuality, because we can never experience a totality. We can only ever experience conditional things. And to experience the world as a whole, we would have to stand outside the world, which is not possible. And therefore, rational cosmology does indeed belong within metaphysics. But when reason is coming to this idea of a totality of all the objects, this idea of a world, then, as I already said, reason is once again dialectical, so it is, so to say, fooling itself. But here there is a difference to how reason is dialectical in the case of the idea of a soul, in the case of the metaphysical field of rational psychology, which I discussed in the last lecture. Because there, reason created certain paralogisms, which, according to Kant, are wrong arguments which fool ourselves. But all of these paralogisms all pointed in one direction. They all seemed to prove what Kant called spiritualism. So the belief that we have a soul which is a spirit, which can be independent of the body and which is immortal. There is also the possibility to believe in materialism, so the belief that we don't have a spiritual soul, we are really just this material body, we are really just our brain. But Kant said that here, reason, if we think about it rationally, always seems to prove spiritualism and not materialism. Now, these seeming proofs, these paralogisms, they are wrong. Spiritualism can't actually be proven. But still, our reason creates this one-sided illusion that spiritualism is the true position and the position that can be proved. In cosmology, Kant says, pure reason in its dialectic doesn't create paralogisms, it creates antinomies. And an antinomy to Kant means that you have two positions which seem to exclude one another. You have a thesis and an antithesis. So, for example, I will get into the antinomies later on, but just as an example, let's take the first one. The first one would, in the thesis, claim that the world has a starting point in time and the world has an end in space, while the antithesis claims that no, the world is infinite. both in time and in space. It is there eternally, and it also has no limits. Now, it seems that out of these two statements, only one can be true and the other must be false. However, Kant says that both, or at least it seems like that, both can be proven by our reason. And that is exactly what an antinomy means. Unlike in rational psychology, where reason is skewing only to one side, here reason seems to be on both sides at the same time. While there, reason only created paralogisms that fooled us, but was not contradicting itself, here, in the rational cosmology, reason creates antinomies and seems to be at odds with itself. This, as Kant says, is the most strange phenomenon of our reason, that it can, get into a conflict with itself. So Kant also says that when it comes to the antinomies, actually it turns out that neither of them can be proven directly. So you can't give a positive proof for either. You can only give a negative proof. That is, you can disprove the opposite. So once again, going with the example of the first antinomy, I cannot really prove the thesis that the world has a starting point in time and has an end in space. But I can say that the opposite just doesn't make sense. The world cannot be infinite. It's not something we can really conceive of. Our thinking demands that there must be a start. Now, whether that start is the Big Bang or God creating the world in 7 days, that can be discussed maybe, but we do demand that there must be a starting point. Time can't just be endless and the world can't have existed forever. But then, on the other hand, if I turn to the antithesis, it's the same way. I cannot really prove that the world is infinite, but I can try to disprove that the world is finite. I can try to point out that this too is something I can't really think. Like, let's just take space and not time. If I say the world has an end in space, then what is beyond that end? It can't be empty space, because that would still be space even if it is empty. But I also can't imagine that space just ends at some point and beyond that there's no space. Like, what would that even look like? Would there be a wall that I hit? And if so, then what's on the other side? Again, is there empty space on the other side? I have to imagine every space being within a bigger space. I cannot imagine space just ending. So both the thesis and the antithesis in an antinomy cannot be proven directly, cannot be proven through a positive argument, but both of them can seemingly be proven by disproving the opposite. And that's why Kant says, whenever there's a conflict between adherents of the thesis and the antithesis in an antinomy, whoever wins the argument depends on who gets to do the attack and who has to simply defend his position. The position cannot really be defended, so the one defending will always lose, the one attacking will always win. But if the defender gets to do a counterattack, so to say, then he will now win. So in a debate, the one who gets the last word would always come out as a winner. but had the other one had the last word, then he would have come out as a winner. Again, this is the most strange phenomenon of our reason, Kant says. And these antinomies, they are important for various reasons. You could say they make up the core of the whole transcendental dialectic in the Critique of Pure Reason. Sure, that dialectic has three parts. It also deals with rational psychology and rational theology, because reason is also dialectical when it comes to the idea of the soul and the idea of God, not just when it comes to the idea of the world. But really, these antinomies make up the core of the dialectic. In fact, Kant also speaks of a dialectic of reason in other contexts and in other works of his, like in his other critiques. So there's also a dialectic of practical reason when it comes to morality. Or there's also a dialectic when we think about the beautiful, and that is what Kant deals with in the critique of the power of judgment. Or there's a dialectic of reason in Kant's philosophy of justice. Even in Kant's pedagogy, you could say there is a dialectic of sorts. But in all of those cases, the dialectic of reason includes only an antinomy. So a conflict between a thesis and an antithesis that both seem to be correct, or that both have arguments why the other side is incorrect. In the Critique of Pure Reason, the dialectic, apart from these antinomies, also contains paralogisms of reason, which I discussed in the last lecture. And it also contains an illusionary ideal of reason, which I will discuss in the next lecture. But in all other instances where Kant talks about dialectic, he's not talking about paralogisms or ideals, he's only talking about an antinomy. And in fact, there seem to be some points where Kant seems to use the words dialectic and antinomy almost as synonyms. And that was very influential when it comes to how the word dialectic was understood after Kant. I mean, nowadays, when we speak of dialectic in philosophy, most people will think of Hegel, or of the ones who were influenced by Hegel and who built on Hegel, like Marx. And their dialectic is usually about some sort of contradiction. You will often hear dialectic being described as a contradiction between a thesis and an antithesis, and then dialectic being about not making a one-sided decision for the thesis or the antithesis and just throwing the other away, but rather creating a synthesis out of both of them. Now, that is actually quite simplified, and that is actually not how Hegel himself describes it in these words. But nonetheless, that is a description of what dialectic became in Hegel and the students of Hegel, or how we came to understood the meaning of the word dialectic. And this, once again, is not what dialectic in total means for Kant, because in total, in general, it means any sort of illusion that reason creates, not just the illusion of an antinomy, of a thesis and an antithesis, and any sort of, attempt to lift these illusions. But we can clearly see, since even in Kant, the antinomies make up the most important part of the dialectic, and outside of the Critique of Pure Reason, dialectic is mostly reduced to just being about antinomies between a thesis and an antithesis and trying to find a synthesis between them, we can easily see how that influenced the later use of the word. But apart from that, even if we just look at Kant himself, this whole chapter on the antinomies is of the greatest importance for him. You could say that this is really the core of the critique of pure reason. This is what the whole critique of pure reason is about. For one, in the antinomies, you can find exemplified what I described in my lecture on dogmatism, skepticism, and criticism. I said there that dogmatic philosophy, so philosophy that blindly believes in our ability to do metaphysics, dogmatic philosophy may try to prove all sorts of beliefs. But the problem is that another opposing dogmatic philosophy may arise, which tries to prove the opposite and has arguments that are just as good. Indeed, Kant says when it comes to all the antinomies that he lists, and again, I will talk about them in a little more detail later on in this lecture, but in the case of all these antinomies, you can find philosophers in the history of philosophy that either supported the thesis or the antithesis. So when we go with the first one again, you can find philosophers believing that the world has a starting point in time or an end in space, but you can also find philosophers that believed in the opposite, that believed in an infinite world. Or, for example, the third antinomy is about freedom. Here the thesis claims that we do have free will, and the antithesis claims that no, there is no such thing as free will. And of course, both are positions that have been supported and believed in by certain thinkers over time. So here we find dogmatic philosophy at odds with itself. Kant says that again and again someone came across the thesis or the antithesis and was unhappy with it, saw that it couldn't really be proven, and therefore disproving this position came to believe in the opposite, not realizing that the opposite could also be disproven. And this, as I explained in that other lecture on dogmatism, skepticism, and criticism, this can first give rise to skepticism, so to the belief that we can't ever get to an answer in these questions. But then that skepticism can in turn lead to criticism, and that is what it did for Kant. So Kant states that it is these antinomies which awoke him from his dogmatic slumber. So the other two parts that his dialectic deals with, the idea of the soul and the idea of God, here Kant also, even before his critical period, here he also was not satisfied with the usual arguments that the dogmatic philosophy, that the Leibniz-Wolffian school of philosophy that was prominent back then in Germany used to prove the soul and the immortality of the soul, or used to prove God. These arguments didn't satisfy Kant, but if it had just been this, then he probably would have tried to show how the common arguments are wrong, and he probably would have just tried to come up with better but still dogmatic arguments for the immortality of the soul or for the existence of God. In fact, at least when it comes to the existence of God, he did just that in his pre-critical time. He already, many years before the Critique of Pure Reason, showed how the common arguments for God are not really proving God, and he tried to come up with a better argument. So the dialectic in the case of the soul, or in the case of the idea of God, was not enough to make Kant come up with criticism. But the dialectic of the antinomies in cosmology, that really startled Kant. Because here he didn't just find an argument of reason that didn't convince him. So he didn't just come to the conclusion that we needed to find a better argument, but rather here he found two arguments of reason that both seemed to be quite convincing and quite correct, but that couldn't possibly both be correct because they both try to prove two opposing statements. And it was only this phenomenon of the natural antinomies, because that's important. To Kant, these are not sophistries created by some pseudo-philosophers, but rather this is natural to our reason. This is an illusion created by our own reason. It was these natural antinomies which in the end convinced Kant that we don't just need to find better arguments to prove our point in metaphysics, rather we need to do a complete critique of reason, of, well, that tool, that faculty of cognition which we are using in metaphysics, and we need to first find out what can reason even do and what can't it do, where are its limits, and how does it work, how come it creates these illusions. That is also why Kant said that had he tried to write his Critique of Pure Reason as a popular book, he would have started with the antinomies. Now, he didn't do that. In fact, they come quite late in the book, after hundreds of pages. That is because Kant is writing a scholarly book for other experts. He didn't intend for the Critique of Pure Reason to be easy to read or to be fun to read, because he didn't intend it to be a book for the masses. He intended it to be a book for the experts. That is why he decided to be systematic in the way he wrote it. But if you wanted to write a more popular version of it, he said, you should start with the antinomies, precisely because they are such a strange phenomenon, and they are the best way to show people that there is something in the very nature of our reason which we first need to understand before we can start to do metaphysics, because otherwise we will just pile up illusions and fool ourselves. And here you can think of Plato's famous statement that philosophy starts with wondering, so with not taking things for granted, but rather starting to wonder about why something is the way it is. Well, here is the place Kant originally started wondering, and here is the place he thinks everyone would start wondering. He also said that if you wanted to understand the Critique of Pure Reason and his transcendental idealism, you should especially get into these antinomies and try to understand them. And he also said that all of his opponents should especially deal with this part of the critique. So he challenged opponents who would disagree with his critical project or who would disagree with his solution of transcendental idealism. He challenged them to take up one of the antinomies, no matter which one, and to try and prove either the thesis or the antithesis. And if Kant is wrong in what he says, then it should be possible to prove one of them. And Kant was absolutely sure that he could disprove any attempted proof for either the thesis or the antithesis. Kant said he could take up the cause, so to say, of either the thesis or the antithesis and defend it against an opponent, while also being able to defend the opposite position against another opponent. No one really took him up on that challenge, which maybe speaks for itself. But Kant did give out this challenge, and he did say that he was willing to respond to any attempt to prove either the thesis or the antithesis. The chapter on the antinomies is also important for the critique as a whole, because here, more than anywhere else, you find Kant employ his three methods of thinking, which I already discussed in their own lectures. So first, the skeptical method, which is about not immediately making a decision, making a judgment, but rather postponing, suspending your judgment for a time, and first inquiring further, first trying to find the truth. And in doing so, trying to make to not strawman the opposite, but rather to steelman the other side, to find the best possible arguments in support of the other side. And that's exactly what Kant is doing here. He is not immediately trying to say either the thesis or the antithesis is correct, but rather he's first trying to make both of them as strong as possible. And then second, we have the critical method. And I mean, this work is the critique of pure reason. Of course, it is employing the critical method, and it is doing so here. So instead of just trying to prove his position and to disprove the opposing position, rather Kant critically asks, where do these positions come from? What is their source? And thereby he tries to find the source of the illusion. Why do both the thesis and the antithesis seem to be correct? Why do we find arguments in support of both of them? And lastly, we have the sympathetic method. So Kant's belief that in such an argument, it's not just that one side is fully right and one side is fully wrong, but rather that even error is only a partial error and still contains a partial truth. And this method was about keeping the partial truths of two opposing positions and combining them into a third position. So forming a synthesis of sorts out of thesis and antithesis. And it is these three methods which Kant employs here in the antinomies. And lastly, they are important because here you see the whole point of Kant's transcendental idealism, which I already explained in its own lecture, because as it will turn out when you apply the critical method, the antinomies only arise when you are not a transcendental idealist, when you are a transcendental realist, when you take the world to be a thing in itself. And on the other hand, the antinomies can very easily be solved, and the whole illusion can be lifted if you subscribe to transcendental idealism. So really, the whole part about the antinomies is the best possible proof that transcendental idealism is indeed correct. Because any other position you could take, any other worldview you could take, leads into this dialectic, leads into this antinomy, leads you to assume two opposing positions that both seem to be correct equally. And you can only get out of this if you subscribe to transcendental idealism. Now, what are the specific antinomies? They all arise from reason's desire for the absolute, for a sort of totality, for something unconditioned. And it should come as no surprise that Kant, in his Architectonic, as everywhere else, follows his table of categories. So he says reason is, when it comes to the idea of the world, is looking for an unconditional in the quantitative, in the qualitative, in the relational, and in the modal sense. First, the quantity. Well, I already discussed this antinomy. I already gave it as an example. Here, reason thinks in the thesis that the world as a whole is limited. It simply can't go on forever. It must have a starting point in time, and it must have a point in space where it ends. And on the other hand, the antithesis claims that no, the world is eternal, it has always been there, and it is infinite, it is going on forever. And as a side note, I find it interesting that we can't escape thinking of the world in that way, even when we are dealing with a world which we know to be finite. Like, of course, in Kant's day, there were no computers yet, but nowadays we do have video games, and in these video games, obviously the worlds we play in are limited, because the programmers are not programming an infinite world. Usually it's a very small area, all things considered, in which we are playing this game. But the world of the game may be limited in some way. Like, maybe the game is taking place in some valley surrounded by mountains, or maybe there's a magical barrier keeping you within the area of the game, or maybe it's on an island and surrounded by water in which you can't swim. But still, we can't help at least imagine that it goes on. Like, if in the game I'm blocked by mountains, I imagine that I could go on the other side of the mountains. And I mean, I know that there is nothing on the other side because there was nothing programmed there. But still, I will at least imagine empty space going on forever. And again, I know that even the empty space doesn't go on forever. The world of the game does indeed have an ending point, but still at that ending point I can't help but imagine it going on. So that would be the first antinomy. Now the second one, the one of quality, here the thesis claims that every composed thing in the world, so right, most things are composed of parts. Like, for example, my body is made up of several cells, and the cells are made up of several atoms, and so on. The thesis claims that all composed things are made up of small indivisible parts. So if I imagine all relations in the world ending, because composition is a sort of relation, right? It is a relation of several parts that form a whole. Like if you build a house with Legos, then the Legos are in relation to one another. And if I imagine all relation in the world ending and all compositions being taken apart into their parts, and again, the parts, if they themselves are compositions, being further divided. So my body being divided into its cells, but then the cells in turn being divided into molecules, and those being divided into atoms, and those being divided into electrons and protons and neutrons. If I just imagine all sorts of composition in the world ending, and everything being divided into its parts, then Kant says, I must think of there being simple parts that cannot further be divided. Because if they could, then, I mean, I'm right now imagining all possible division happening. I'm imagining all compositions being taken apart. And if this could go on forever, then I would in the end be left with nothing. But composed objects cannot be composed out of nothings. They must be composed of something. So if I take all composition away, something must remain. And that something must not itself be composed of parts. So therefore, there must be simple parts. There must be, so to say, simple particles out of which everything else is made up. You could call these atoms in the true sense, because, I mean, the word atom, translated from Greek, literally means indivisible. And for the longest time, for over 2000 years, since the days of Leucippus and Democritus, so since the time of the pre-Socratics, really, till Kant's own day, and even past Kant's own day, and that is what the word atom meant. A smallest, not further divisible part. And really, we are using the word atom wrongly today, because we started applying it to parts which we later found out can be further divided. So these are in fact not atoms, and correctly should probably get some sort of other name. But now we are used to calling them atoms, and that's stuck more or less. Or you could call these things with the term that was used back then in the 18th century, with the term that was used prominently by Leibniz. You could call them monads. So in Leibniz, a monad is not exactly the same as an atom. A monad is sort of a thinking atom, or an atom with consciousness, a soul atom, so to say. But anyways, the thesis claims the world is made up of two atoms, or of monads, that is, of simple, indivisible parts. And the antithesis, again, is claiming the opposite. The antithesis says that no, the division, the process of division can go on forever. Like if you take an apple, you can cut it in half, and then you can take one half and you can cut it in half again. And then you can take one of these halves and you can cut it in halves again. And of course, the physical division will come to an end at some point. So there will come a point where we simply will not be able mechanically to further divide this thing, because it has turned so small that it's not possible to cut it further with a knife. But at least in our thinking, we can imagine the division continuing. And as mathematics teaches us, there is no smallest part in space, right? In geometry, if I have a line, I can divide the line in half, and I can divide that half again, and so on. I can go down from meters to centimeters and to millimeters and to nanometers, and I can go down to such a small distance between 2 points that it could not be possibly visualized, and that we don't even have any names for it anymore. But still, I could forever go on and further divide my line. Going on to the third antinomy, the one of relation. Here we have reason once again asking for the absolute, for the unconditional, and that would be the idea of freedom, right? So when you have a succession of cause and effect, that means that the effect is always just conditional. The effect is conditioned by the cause. But if that cause is itself an effect of something else, then it is again conditional. And that something else, the cause of the cause, is its condition. But if that again, the cause of the cause, also has a cause, then you can see how this would go on forever. And this doesn't satisfy reason. So reason says that there must be some point where there is a cause that may cause other things, but that itself is not cause, that itself does not have a condition, even though it is a condition for other things. And that would be freedom. I mean, that is the definition of freedom. Being able to start a chain of causality, being able to be a cause without yourself being caused by something else. And this is what the thesis claims, while the antithesis will claim the opposite. The antithesis will state, no, this chain of causality goes on forever. Every cause is not free, but is itself caused by another earlier cause, which in turn again has a cause of its own. Well, and last, when it comes to modality, the antinomy is about necessity and contingency. Because everything that is not necessary, everything that is contingent, does depend for its existence on something else. If that something else too is contingent, then again, it depends on something else, and so on. That means that all these contingent things may have relative necessity, that is, they are necessary in relation to something else. Right, so I can say if I throw a stone against the window, I can say the window now being broken is necessary in relation to that stone hitting it. Since the stone hit the window, it had to break. But in an absolute sense, the window breaking was not necessary, because the stone hitting the window was not necessary in the first place. So if all these things are of relative necessity, Kant says, the thesis claims there needs to be something, one thing at least, which is of absolute necessity. So something which doesn't exist because something else exists, but could also not exist if that something else on which it depended didn't exist, but rather something which must exist, simply by its very essence. On the other hand, the antithesis yet again claims the opposite. It says that no, everything is contingent and of only a relative necessity, and there is no such thing as an absolute necessity. These are the four antinomies. I will not go into the specific arguments Kant gives for both sides. If you care about that, you can read up on it yourself. But the point is that Kant goes into very long and extensive series of arguments for both sides, and as I already said, he was convinced that he could give arguments, and not just sophistic arguments that manipulate you, that seem to be correct but really are just logical tricks, but rather he was convinced that he could give correct arguments for both sides. If you look at the antinomies and if you think back to the principles of the intellect, and I made a lecture about that, about the schematism and the principles, then the antinomies should be somewhat familiar to you. The intellect, after all, with its 12 categories, is the condition of the possibility of experience. And Kant says that all our experience must happen along those 12 categories. And therefore, from those categories, we can derive at these principles, which are synthetic judgments a priori about the experience. So we can, even before making experience, we can say that it will follow some general principles that it has to follow, because otherwise it could not become experience for us. Well, here in the antinomies, what is happening is basically reason being applied to these principles and demanding totality corresponding to each of these principles. So when it comes to quantity, the principle of the intellect was what Kant called the axiom of viewing, or the axiom of intuition, which stated that everything I will ever view in time and space will have a certain extension in time and space. Now that is something I can be sure of a priori. I can't know what extension it will have, if it will have a huge extension or a small one, but I can know that it will have some sort of extension in time and space. And here in the first antinomy, reason is basically now saying, okay, so everything will be extended in time and space. So that means that the world as the whole, as the sum of everything, of all the extended things, will also be the sum of all extension. So reason now asks, how far is that extension going? Does it have, as the thesis claims, an end somewhere? Or, as the antithesis claims, does that extension go on forever without end? When it comes to quality, the principle was called by Kant the anticipation of perception. And the principle said that everything I will sense, every impression I will have a certain intensity. So every taste, every light I see, every pain I feel, every pleasure I feel, everything will have a certain intensity. Well, once again, reason basically says to this, okay, fine, everything will have an intensity. Now, if I reduce the objects that are composed of several parts, which all may have a certain quality, will I ever get to a simple part which maybe still has a quality, maybe still has a certain intensity that could be increased or reduced, but which cannot be reduced anymore quantitatively. So which cannot be reduced anymore in its extension, but only in its intensity. If we look at relation, here we had several principles called by Kant analogies of experience. And the one that was coming from the category of causality said that in the world, everything that happens must have a cause. So that is, again, what our intellect is saying, and what we can say a priori, because it is a condition of the possibility of even making experience, because if something happened without a cause, I could not experience it. And again, reason is saying, okay, fine, but where's the end to this principle? Reason, demand an absolute here. So if everything is to have a cause, reason, ask, is there a first and uncaused cause? So is there freedom at some point? Or does this chain of causality go on forever and forever and forever? And lastly, when it comes to modality, we had the postulates of empirical thinking. And again, reason here is asking for a totality of modality. So reason is asking, is there ever something which is necessary, so to say, by its own virtue, and not just necessary in relation to something else, or is everything that is contingent? So really, reason is always demanding a completion of sorts. So reason is looking at these principles of our intellect and asking, okay, this is what we can say about our experience a priori, but where is, so to say, the end of experience? Reason is considering the whole system of experience, the whole system of the world, and asking to find a totality here somewhere. So as Kant says, reason asks for a sort of completion of the chain of succession in first the composition of things. So the composition of the whole world, where does that end? In the decomposition of things, so if I decompose the things, if I take them apart, where does that end? Is there a point where they cannot be taken apart further, or can they always be further divided? Reason is also asking for an end of the chain of succession, or a completion of that chain when it comes to the emergence of things, so being caused by other things. Reason asks for the end of that causal chain. And reason asks for completion in the dependence of things on each other in their existence. So if one thing, if the existence of that thing depends on the existence of another thing, and that other thing's existence depends on yet another thing's existence, where's the end to that? Is there something necessary? So something whose existence depends on itself and not on another thing. And the problem, the reason why an antinomy arises in all four of these questions is that reason demands a sort of completion, but Kant says we will always arrive at a thought that either is too huge for our intellect, so something which we can't really think, like the world as a whole is something that is too big for us. We can't really think what an end to the world would look like. Or a smallest part, something which cannot further be divided, a true atom, a true monad. and yet which still is to be something that exists in space, and that despite not having an extension in space, together with other such parts which also have no extension, can actually form a whole. Like, how can several mathematical points ever form a line? Or freedom. Freedom also is something we can't really think. It's a thought too big for our intellect, Kant says. Now, most people will not realize that because they are too superficial in their thinking. They will think, oh, free will is something easy to think. But no, actually, thinking of something which is absolutely spontaneous, which is not caused by anything, but just happening because it happens, that is something that we can't really make sense of. And lastly, necessity, true and absolute necessity, Kant calls the abyss of reason. That is the one thought that really is too large for our intellect, that really goes beyond anything we can conceive of. So on the one side, we have thoughts that are too huge for our intellect, but on the other side, we have thoughts that are sort of too small for our intellect, that don't satisfy our thinking, because we are saying, well, as long as I have not reached the end of the world, or as long as I have not reached the end of the divisible, or as long as I have not reached the end of the chain of causality, or as long as I have not reached the end of the contingent and found something necessary, I'm not at the end. I can still go on, so I will still go on, and I will try to seek a point where I can't go on further. So I'm not satisfied with this. It is too small for my thinking. And that is exactly the problem in the antinomies. We are forced to think of something which either goes beyond our understanding, or, on the other hand, something which doesn't really satisfy our understanding. Now, in earlier lectures about the table of categories and about the principles of the intellect, I explained that according to Kant, there are two classes. The categories of quantity and quality belong to the mathematical class, and the categories of relation and modality belong to the dynamical class. And this is important here again, because of course the same is true for the antinomies now. The first two antinomies are called mathematical antinomies by Kant, and they, according to him, are about the world, while the other two, the dynamical categories, are about nature. Because to Kant, these two, world and nature, are not exactly the same. The world, to him, is an aggregate of parts. The world is basically just the sum of all the objects, everything we could perceive. So the world is the aggregate of that which can be viewed and which appears to us in viewing. And basically here, what reason demands is a totality of this aggregate that can be viewed in time and space. The antinomy of quantity demands a totality of the progress from the parts to the whole. So if I progress through space, will there ever be an end to that progress? Will I ever get to the end of space? So again, it is about the totality of composition. And the antinomy of quality, as I already said, is about the totality of decomposition. So it is about the regress, Kant says. So going from the whole to the parts, the question is each part again a whole made up of smaller parts, or will I ever get to a point where I, in this regress, where I reach parts which are not made up of smaller parts again? Now, nature, on the other hand, nature to Kant is not just like the world, the aggregate of everything we can perceive in time and space, but rather nature is the system of everything we can experience. And experience, I made another lecture about that. Experience always means our intellect making a necessary connection between our perceptions. So when we speak about a world, we are basically just perceiving several parts, several objects alongside each other. And therefore we say that they are all part of one and the same world. But when we are speaking of nature, we are experiencing these objects being dependent on each other, causing each other, forming a system with each other. We are experiencing one object being the way it is and having the place it has because of another object to which it is related and with which it is connected. As I explained in earlier lectures, on what is science to Kant and what is his architectonic method in science. To him, an aggregate can always be compared to a pile of sand, where the parts, the individual grains, are not necessary. I could always take one away or place it at another point or add new parts. While on the other hand, a system could be compared to an organic body, where the organs are necessary parts of the whole, and each part depends on the other and has its specific place where it must be. From this difference between mathematical and dynamical antinomies, we can also realize that in the first two, in the mathematical antinomies, reason is not really going beyond the world. And reason is not really going beyond the sensual. I mean, all reason is asking for here is the totality of the sensual, either of the composition, so all sensual objects together, the whole world together, of the decomposition. So the single part out of which all the composed sensual objects are made up of. But still, reason is sort of staying within the realm of the sensual. Now, these two antinomies still belong within metaphysics and not physics, because reason is demanding an end to sensuality. Reason is demanding a limit to sensuality. And as Kant says, when I'm thinking of a border, I always must think of that which is beyond the border. Something can only be limited by something else which is limiting it, right? So if you think of the borders of a country, it must border another country which limits this first country, or maybe it must border the sea which limits the country as it limits the land. But there must be something else. There must be another realm at the border. There can't just be a border and then nothing beyond. Or I mean, in that case, the nothing would be what limits the something. So, therefore, the first two antinomies still belong within metaphysics, because when reason asks where is the limit of the sensual, well, it must be limited, it must be bordered by the supersensual. But when it comes to the two dynamic antinomies, there reason is not staying within the realm of the sensual, and they are not metaphysical, they are not about the supersensual only indirectly, but rather here reason is asking for the supersensual directly. Reason is saying nature as a system of cause and effect, and as a system of contingent objects being contingent, being dependent on other contingent objects. Nature needs to be complete, needs something that goes beyond nature, needs something that is supersensual, that is freedom and necessity. Because both of those are things that cannot possibly be experienced, right? You cannot experience that something is necessary, even if it was necessary. You could not tell from experience. From experience, we can always only tell that something exists, that something is the case, but we cannot tell that it could not possibly not exist and not be the case. And the same is true for freedom. When it comes to freedom, like for example, when I say I'm free to keep sitting here, or I'm free to get up and walk out, well, I claim that this is the case and I believe that this is the case, but I cannot experience this freedom, because when I have the choice between A and B, I will always pick one. Let's say I will pick A, and I cannot really experience that I could have picked B too. I can only experience that I picked A. And I can think that I could also have picked B, but I cannot prove it from experience. As long as I keep sitting here, I don't have the experience that I could stand up. And if I now stand up and walk out to prove to myself that I can, then again, I will not have the experience that I could also have kept sitting here. So freedom and necessity are supersensual. They completely go beyond our sensuality, beyond our viewing. While the whole of the world, or the smallest part of the world, as such doesn't go beyond our viewing, but still, to think of it, we must think again of something supersensual, something beyond our viewing, which is at the border and which is limiting the sensual. Now, before I get to Kant's solution of the problem of the antinomies, I first want to talk about their importance a bit. The most important or the most interesting antinomy to us may be the third one, so the one of relation. The question, is there freedom or is there no freedom? And indeed, Kant says that out of the three ideas that metaphysics mainly deals with, the ideas of God, immortality of the soul, and freedom, it is freedom which is the idea of rational cosmology, so of this field of metaphysics that has these antinomies. I do want to stress, however, that this antinomy is not about the question whether we, as human beings, have free will. It is just about the question, is there such a thing as freedom at all? Because the intellect is saying that everything in nature has a cause. That is one of the principles of the intellect. And now reason, always desiring something absolute, asks, okay, in this chain of cause and effect, is there a first cause which, as a first cause, cannot itself be caused, and therefore which must be its own cause, which must be free? But the thesis could be answered with yes, even if there was only one free act in the world. Like, we could say that maybe God was free in creating the world, but from that point on, since God created the world, or since the Big Bang, everything is caused, including our actions. So therefore, we have no free will, only God was free. We could say that, and reason would be content with that answer. because reason is only demanding an absolute, a start to the chain of causality. Reason is not demanding several absolutes. So reason is not demanding several free beings, or even several free acts. Like, we could even say that maybe God was free to create the world, but then his freedom ended. He's not free to interact with the world anymore. That would still satisfy reason in a way. So this antinomy, if we could prove the thesis that freedom exists, that would not yet prove that we are free. But still, Kant says, if we could prove that freedom is at all possible within nature, then there could at least be the possibility that we also have this freedom. While on the other hand, if the antithesis could be proven, if we could prove that there is no freedom, then that would immediately also exclude our free will. And this question of free will is something that is still discussed very much today. The other antinomies, especially the first ones, the mathematical ones, they may not be of such interest nowadays. You don't have, most people don't have strong opinions on whether the world has an end in space or is going on forever, but they do probably have strong opinions on whether we have free will or not. But the thing is that, like basically all metaphysical debates nowadays, because they are all done without any knowledge of Kant, so they are all pre-critical, they are all dogmatic. This question is usually discussed in the most superficial manner. So on the one hand, you have, let's say, the everyday person who probably believes that he is free, that he has free will, but who never really reflects about that and never really questions how that is possible. I mean, that everyday person probably still believes in the laws of nature, and therefore in nature being under the general law of causality. That person probably still believes that the apple is falling from the tree not because it just so happens to fall, but because there is gravity pulling that apple towards the earth. Or the tree is falling not just because, but rather because maybe a storm made it fall, or some lumberjack with its axe made it fall. And also, those people will think of themselves as being dependent on causality. They will think of themselves as not just having popped up one day out of nowhere, but being caused by their parents. And depending on various things, like, for example, depending on oxygen and depending on food. And without those, you would die pretty soon. So they would cause your death. This would not be a free decision if food was taken from you, but you would have to die without food. So if you believe that the world generally is under this law of causality and that everything in the world has a cause, then why should that not also be true for you? I mean, it is simply ridiculous to assume that everything else is caused, but in us, like in our brains, let's say, which are also part of the world, part of nature after all, and which also are caused, like the rest of our body, that in our brain there's a sort of vacuum of causality, like a sort of empty bubble in which we can make free decisions. And even if there was, which again is an absurd thought, but even if it was true, then that would leave the question how we could, so to say, reach out of that bubble of causal vacuum into, well, the outside world of that bubble, where causality exists, and how we could, with the free decisions we make in our head, influence the world which otherwise is not free. That would be a sort of version of the general body-soul problem, an old problem in philosophy which I discussed in the last lecture on the soul. But then, on the other hand, we have people claiming there is no such thing as free will. And this is basically the reigning ideology nowadays. And I'm saying ideology because it is that. It is not scientific, even if the supporters of this ideology may claim to be very scientific usually. It is not scientific. There is no scientific proof that we have no free will. And there never will be, because there can't. Freedom is something supersensual, so you can't either prove or disprove it with empirical means. That's simply not possible. And still, this is now claimed to be basically the only scientific worldview. And you will probably have lots of natural scientists, like physicists or biologists, neuroscientists, scientists studying the brain. Lots of them will nowadays make the claim that there is no such thing as free will. And most people who think of themselves as being very scientific people and maybe atheists, materialists, will probably claim there is no such thing as free will. But again, this is something that, even if it was true, could not possibly be proven by empirical means. And therefore, this is completely unscientific, taking this as a fact. And you will often hear the claim nowadays that the more recent experiments we made on the brain prove that there is no free will. You will hear the claim that, oh, now we know that before someone is making a movement, even before he is conscious of wanting to make a movement, of making that decision to move his arm or whatever, we can already see things happening in the brain that cause that movement. Therefore, there is no freedom. And you will often hear that the studies into the brain that have been done in the more recent years and decades, that they make more or less obsolete a lot of the philosophy of the past centuries, including Kant. And you will not just hear this by lay people, who maybe somewhat can be excused for the ignorance. And you will not just hear this from natural scientists, who, when saying something like this, prove to be, well, scholarly cyclops and egoists of science, as Kant would call them. I talked about this in my lecture on what is wisdom. So they are experts in one subject who make the mistake of not looking at other subjects, and especially not looking at philosophy, and who make the mistake of believing their expertise in one subject allows them to venture into all sorts of other areas and subjects and be experts there too. But no, you will hear this claim even from people within what is considered philosophy. So I heard that when studying, and not just from some co-eds in the first semester who can be somewhat excused for not knowing better. No, even professors will now act as if Kant had never lived. Even professors will often spew the most primitive and most superficial dogmatism and materialism, and will make you question what gives them the right to be professors, usually as professors being quite well paid by taxpayer money, I might add, if they apparently know so little of their subject and of the history of their own subject, and have so little understanding of their own subject. Because whatever we may find when it comes to the brain cannot add anything at all to the question of free will. And if you actually read up on earlier philosophers like Kant or like Spinoza, you will realize that they basically already said everything that could be said about this, and no empirical study or experiment could possibly add to that. I mean, Spinoza already was a fatalist. He already believed that there is no free will, without knowing what we know about the brain today. Because this is a question about principle. Is it possible for us to be spontaneous and make our own decisions independent of nature, or are we caused by nature? We don't need to know how nature works specifically. So what specifically in nature may cause our actions? We need to answer the general question. Does nature cause us at all? And that is a metaphysical question, not an empirical one. Empirically, we can only find out, okay, what specifically is happening in our brains. But even before we knew those things, like, I'm not denying that we know a lot more about how our brain works than we did in Kant's time, but back then, well, those who said there is no freedom would say that it is our representations which make us act in a certain way. So if I have maybe the representation of hunger, I will eat. If I have the representation of horniness, I will seek out sexual pleasure. And these representations in turn are caused by nature. They are caused maybe by the workings of my own body, or they are caused by what impressions I have, what I see, what I feel, and so on. Now again, what we know about about the brain nowadays allows us to speak about this in more detail. To not just say in general, someone's representations caused him to act in this way. But the general question hasn't changed because of that, and nothing has been added to the general question because of that. But of course, the same is also true in the other direction, because there are some people nowadays who believe in free will, and who also try to find proof for that in natural science. In more recent years, it has become somewhat popular to turn to quantum physics and say, well, there is no causality in the realm of quantum physics, and things are just happening there without a cause, and therefore it is possible that we also act without a cause and are free. Now, I would question whether it is true that there is no causality in the quantum realm, or whether we just can't really observe and find that causality. I would say that the absence of causality, even if it was absent, could also not be proven empirically. Empirically, we could only know that we haven't found a cause, but not that there is no cause. But that aside, even if it was really sure that there was a level of existence where things happen without a cause, that, of course, has nothing to do, at least not directly, with what is happening in our brains and what decisions we are making. And this is just a cheap way out. And therefore, you will also usually find people trying to prove free will, or at least the possibility of free will, with this claim, who actually are not quantum physicists, who actually don't know what they are talking about. They have just heard, oh, in quantum physics there are no causes, and thought maybe I can use that to justify my belief in freedom. So really, empirically, we can neither prove that freedom is a thing, nor can we prove predeterminism. Because that is what Kant calls this position of the antithesis. Nowadays, you will usually find it being called determinism. So when someone denies freedom, we call him a determinist. But that really only shows how the so-called philosophers, actually philodoxers and professors of the history of philosophy, how the so-called philosophers of our days are very sloppy in their thinking and don't really reflect and think about the terminology they are using. They are using it mindlessly, the way they have learned it from everyone else, which is unaufklärt. Because Aufklärung means thinking for yourself and questioning things. Because Kant says everything, every action is determined. If it is a free action, it is still determined. That just means it is not determined by a cause outside of it, but rather it is determining itself. But it is still being determined. Something cannot be completely undetermined. So that is why Kant is saying we should rather talk not of determination, but of predetermination, because that is really what we mean when we are saying there is no freedom. Not just that my action was determined, but that it was not determined by myself the way I wanted to determine it, but that it was predetermined by another cause. But anyways, so the third antinomy may be of the most interest to us, but the second and the fourth one are also important for the other two ideas of metaphysics. Right, I said in the lecture on metaphysics that according to Kant, this science deals mainly with the immortality of the soul, with freedom, and with God. And while it is only freedom which specifically belongs to rational cosmology, while immortality and God belong to their own fields, to rational psychology and to rational theology, still the second and the fourth antinomy are important as a fundament for these two, Kant says. Because the second antinomy, here the thesis says that the world is made up of smallest, not further divisible parts, right? Well, if that is the case, those probably could not be destroyed because they cannot be further divided, right? They cannot be, so to say, cut up. That would mean they are incorruptible. And this, as I explained in the previous lecture of the soul, this was an argument that the Leibniz-Wolffian philosophers used for the immortality of the soul. They said, well, the soul is a monad. It's not composed out of parts, and therefore it also cannot be taken apart, and therefore it must be immortal. And that is why the thesis of the second antinomy would be important to them. Now, again, just like the third antinomy thesis does not prove that we are free, only that something is free, the second antinomy's thesis does not prove that our soul is indivisible, just that there's something indivisible in the world. The soul could still be composed out of many parts and could still be, therefore, something which you could take apart. But if there is such a thing as a monad, as an indivisible part, then that leaves at least the possibility that the soul is one of those things. While, on the other hand, if you say that everything can be divided further and further, that would also be true for the soul, and therefore the soul could not be immortal. With that said, however, even if you could prove the second thesis, that there are indivisible parts, and even if you could furthermore prove that the soul is one such part, as Kant says, and as I explained in the previous lecture of the soul, that would still not be a sufficient argument to prove the immortality of the soul, because that would just mean it could not be destroyed in a quantitative way by being taken apart, but it could possibly still be destroyed in a qualitative way by fading away, by consciousness sort of dying out. But anyways, when it comes to the fourth antinomy, we are asking for something necessary, and that is important as a fundament for the idea of God, because God would be a necessary being, right? God would be something that is not contingent, so not something that happens to exist but could also not exist and only exists because something else brought it into existence. But God, if there is a God, would be a necessary being, something that must exist. But again, the fourth thesis, even if we could prove the fourth thesis, that would not mean that we have already proven God. The fourth thesis is just saying there must be something necessary if everything else in the world is contingent. Now, that something could be God, who made the world, but it could also be the world itself, right? There just must be some necessary being. But for example, Spinoza equated God and the world. He said Deus sive natura, so God or nature, they are really one. Or if you look to the ancient Greeks, you often had the position of hylomorphism. Hyle meaning matter and morphe meaning form. So that's the opinion that matter is equally eternal as form or as God, and matter is something necessary, something uncaused and uncreated, and all that God did was not creating matter out of nothing, but just bringing form into matter, forming the raw chaos and giving it some sort of order. So such positions would not be ruled out, even if you could prove that there is something necessary. But again, while proving the thesis would not prove our idea of God, at least it could, if there is a necessary being, then be possible that there is such a thing as God. While on the other hand, if you could prove the antithesis, so if you could prove that there is no necessary being, that would immediately rule out God. So you could say that the second, third, and fourth thesis, even though they are not enough to prove our three ideas that metaphysics deals with, they form the fundament of these ideas of immortality, freedom, and God. Only the first antinomy is not related directly to one of the ideas Kant says, but it leads us to the general idea of the supersensual. So when I ask where is the end of sensuality, does sensuality ever end? Does the world have an end? that leads me to the idea of something supersensual, which would border, so to say, which would enclose, so to say, which would limit the world. And then the other three antinomies would specify this general but vague idea of the supersensual by thinking of the supersensual as an indivisible monad, or as uncaused freedom, or as absolute necessity. We can also, when reflecting on those four antinomies, we can also note that the thesis in all four cases is a rationalistic position, and represents more or less the position of the Leibniz-Wolffian dogmatic philosophy, which was reigning in Germany in 18th century. And I mean, the critique of pure reason is ultimately mostly a critique of that philosophy. On the other hand, the antithesis is always more empiricist, right? So the rationalist position, for example, would be to say, well, if I think about the world, I simply have to think that the world ends somewhere, while the empiricist position would be to say, well, I don't care what your thinking says. When I look around at the world, I'm not experiencing an end. No matter where I look, the world always goes on. I'm not reaching an end. And I also know a priori that I can't possibly experience such an end, because to experience a border is only possible if you in some way experience that which is beyond the border. So to experience the end of sensuality would require us to in some way experience the supersensual, which is not possible. Or think of the third antinomy. Rationalism says we have to think of freedom, and we have to think of the chain of causality starting somewhere and not going on forever. While empiricism again says, well, but I have not experienced freedom so far. Whenever I found something happening in the world, I always found that I could find a cause that made it happen. And also I know a priori that I will never experience freedom. Even if it did exist, we could only experience that we acted in a certain way. We could not ever experience that we could also have acted in another way. So you could say that in a way, the four antinomies are once again about the conflict between rationalism and empiricism, or you could say they are once again about the concept between Leibniz, who was so influential for German philosophy in 18th century, and Newton, who was so important to Kant, and by whom Kant was influenced so much. Kant also reflects on the interest our reason has towards wanting the thesis to be true or wanting the antithesis to be true. And he notes that we have a practical interest in the thesis, because they are, as I already said, they would be the fundament for our belief in the immortality of our soul, in God, in our freedom, and therefore they would be the fundament of religion and morality. And if they are not true, if the antitheses are true, then there could not be such a thing as religion or morality. If the soul is not immortal and if there is no God, then there's no point to religion. And if there is no freedom, so if all my actions are predetermined and I'm not responsible for my actions, then there is no point for morality. So clearly we have a practical interest in the thesis being true. And also Kant says our reason has an architectonic interest in the thesis being true. Because reason by its very nature is architectonic. It wants a system, systematic unity of the parts, and a necessary composition of the parts, not just an unfinished aggregate. And well, that is what the theses offer, right? They offer an endpoint, something absolute, a completed totality in our thinking. The world as a whole, the smallest parts of the world, freedom, which doesn't require the question, why did someone act like this, why did this happen, but which makes an end to this question. And necessity, something necessary out of which all the contingent things do come. But then on the other hand, Kant says that the speculative interest of reason, so reason as theoretical reason, wanting to find out truth, wanting to inquire into the truth and into the nature of things. You could also say reason wanting to do science. The speculative interest of reason leans more towards the antithesis. Because if the antitheses are true, that means that we can always keep going on using our reason to inquire into the world, and using our reason to understand the world. If the antitheses are true, we can always keep going with our science, right? If the world has no end, then no matter how far I looked, how many stars the astronomers discovered, we can still keep going. If the world is not made up of small indivisible parts, then even though we found the atoms, even though we found atoms to in turn be made up of electrons and neutrons and protons, we can still go further. Even now that we are dealing with quantum physics, we can maybe go further down. So there is no end to it. And likewise, if there is no freedom, then that means whenever something happens, I can try to find the cause. I can try to find out what made it happen. And if there's nothing necessary, again, for every contingent thing, I can ask, why is it? Why does it exist? What other thing made it exist? But if we allow the thesis to be true, if we allow, for example, for something necessary or for freedom, then our science, then our reason, which always asks for the cause, for the justification of something, would be cut off at some point. Then we could always say, when someone asks, why did this happen? We could say, well, because it was a free action. You have to stop asking why. There is no further answer. It happened because someone did it. If we allowed for things like miracles to happen, then we could not do natural science properly, Kant says. But rather, whenever something happens in nature, someone could tell us, well, this was caused by God, or this is magic, or whatever. So our inquiry, our speculation would just come to an end, to an arbitrary stop. And therefore, the speculative, the scientific interest of reason, which doesn't want to stop, but also always wants to seek further answers, that interest is on the side of the antithesis. But now on to Kant's answer to the antinomies. And as I already said at the start, that answer depends on his transcendental idealism. Because Kant says the whole issue here is that we don't properly distinguish between the sensual and the supersensual. And we are sort of forgetting that the world that appears to us is just an appearance and not a thing in itself. Because neither the completely unconditional, the absolute first and the absolute beginning, nor a complete chain of conditions, an infinity of conditions, neither the one nor the other could ever possibly be experienced. I described previously, I made a lecture about what is experience, that experience is a connection that our intellect makes between several perceptions, thinking of them as being necessarily connected. So when I make the experience that the stone lying in the sun is hot because of the sun shining on it, I'm saying that the perception of the hotness of the stone is necessarily connected to my perception of the sun shining on it. To make such a necessary connection, however, with the intellect, both parts, the conditional, so the stone which is hot, and its condition, so the sun in this example, both of them must be within experience. Both of them must be sensual. I cannot connect one perception to something else which I'm not perceiving. I can only connect two perceptions, so two sensual representations. And therefore, the condition, just like the conditional, must be part of experience. And that is something that is overlooked in the antinomies. And so Kant's answer is not saying that either the thesis or the antithesis is correct and the other is wrong. I already said he employs his sympathetic method here, which rather tries to find the partial truths in two opposing positions and to unite them into a third, into a middle position. The thing is that it seems that in each of the four antinomies you have a disjunctive judgment. So either the world has a start and an end, or it is infinite. Either the world is made up of indivisible parts, or it can be divided forever and ever. Either there is freedom, or everything is predetermined. Either there is something necessary, or everything is contingent. It seems that in each of these cases you must make one decision. You must either agree with the thesis or the antithesis. But that is in fact not the case, Kant says. That is only the case in a proper logical division. So if I divide a concept logically into something and its opposite, into A and non-A. If, for example, I say all human beings are either dead or alive, then yes, I have to make a decision. I have to say, okay, Kant is a human being, so therefore he's either dead or alive. Now he's dead, so he can't be alive. But Kant says, apart from these logical divisions, there are also dialectical divisions or dialectical contradictions or dialectical opposites. And here it just seems as if we have to decide between these two options. But this is in fact not the case, because the two options are not necessarily logical opposites. They just seem to be. Kant gives some examples for this. One example would be if you say everything either smells good or it smells bad. That could lead to a dialectic antinomy, where you disprove one side and therefore come to the conclusion that the other side must be true. So you could say the faculty of cognition does not smell good. Since we can disprove that it smells good, that only leaves the one opposing option that it smells bad. But of course that is not the case, Kant says, because the true opposite of smelling good, because I also have the option of saying it does not have a smell at all, neither a good smell nor a bad smell. So the true opposite of something smelling good is not it smelling bad, but it is it not smelling good. And it could not be smelling good because it's smelling bad, or simply because it's not smelling at all. Or likewise, you could be asked, does a four-angled circle have angles or not? This could lead to a dialectic antinomy, because you could say, well, a circle does not have angles. So since it is a circle, clearly the answer is it has no angles. Or you could say, wait, it was specifically stated that it has four angles. If it has four angles, then clearly it is four-angled. But actually the answer should be a four-angled circle neither has nor does not have angles. Rather, a four-angled circle is not a thing, because if a figure is four-angled, then it is not a circle. And if a figure is a circle, then it is completely round. It does not have angles. Or as the last example, Kant says, if you are standing exactly at the North Pole, then the question, are you facing eastward or westward, stops making sense. At the pole, there is no east or west anymore. And these examples should show that what seems to be a contradictory opposite, where you would have to make a decision between one of the two opposites, can also be a dialectical opposite, where the opposition is just an illusion. And this is actually the case in the antinomies, Kant says. The illusion, Kant says, is created by thinking that you are making a statement about the world in itself, when actually the world is not a thing in itself, but just an appearance. So let's take the first antinomy as an example. You could say the world has an end, or you could say the world goes on forever. But in both cases, you are talking or trying to talk about the world in itself. You're saying the world independently of me and of me experiencing it does end somewhere or does not end anywhere. But in fact, the world is that which you experience. So you must not ask what the world is independently of your experience. You must ask what the world is that you experience. And there you can say that you don't experience an end, but you also don't experience its endlessness. All you can say is that your experience does not end. That does not mean that the world is endless, independent of your experience. You can just say that as long as you make experience, the world will go on. But more specifically, what Kant says is that in the first two antinomies, both the thesis and the antithesis are both wrong. Why is that the case? Well, on the one hand, the world as a whole, or also a smallest and indivisible part of the world, would both be something unconditional, something absolute. And something like that cannot be experienced. It can only be thought of, it can only be conceptualized, but it cannot be experienced. Also, the world is appearing to us in time and space. Those are, as I explained in the lecture on sensuality, those are the forms of our viewing. We must view everything in time and space. Well, geometry clearly teaches us that those go on forever, right? In geometry, space does not have an end. I can take a line in space and I can extend it forever. There is no end to it. And likewise, I can cut up that line into ever smaller parts, and there is no end to this either. So, and the same, of course, is true with time, right? I can, in time, there is no starting point. I can imagine going back in time forever. I can imagine going back in time a second or a minute, a day, a year, but I can also imagine going back in time 10,000 trillion years. Now, even if I know that the Big Bang didn't happen that long ago, I can still imagine a time going back endlessly. There's nothing stopping me when I think of, let's say, 10 billion years ago. There's nothing stopping me of thinking 10 billion years and a second ago. And of course, I can also divide time as much as I want. Like, I can divide a day into hours and hours into minutes and minutes into seconds, and I can further divide seconds, and I can always divide time, just like space, into smaller parts, into smaller units, and I will never reach the smallest part. Now, all of this may sound like an argument for the two antitheses, for saying the world is without end and without smallest part, but saying that it is, so the world is there as an endless thing and as something not made up of smallest parts, that would be a claim about a world itself. That would be a claim about a world independent of appearing to me. Infinity is nothing that could ever possibly appear to me, but the world is only that which appears to me. And that is why Kant's solution in the two mathematical antinomies is to say both the thesis and the antithesis are both wrong. Because of the world in itself, and whether it's finite or infinite, we know nothing. But when it comes to the world that appears to us, what we can say is that, as Kant puts it, the regress is infinite. So I can say that when I go back, when I go through the world, I will never find a limit in space. I will never reach the end of the world. Wherever I go, I will always be able to go further. And if not physically further, because it's beyond my means, at least I will always be able to think of going further. And likewise, when I divide the things in the world, I will always be able, at least in my thinking, to imagine them being even further divided. But that is not saying that they are. So the regress towards the end of the world, or towards the absolute division into smallest part, the regress is endless. I will never get to an end point in that regress. But that does not mean that the world outside of me making that regress already is there in itself as something infinite. Because the sensual world, after all, is just that. It's the sensual world. It is only there for my senses. So it does not make sense to talk about it as being independent of my senses, and to ask what it is independently of that which I can sense. Kant says this would mean thinking of experience as being possible without experience, without being experienced. It would mean thinking of an appearance that does not appear, that makes no sense. The world is that which appears to me. And as an appearance, it is endless in the sense that it will always keep appearing. I can never get to a part of the world where it just stops appearing. And that I know a priori. But that does not mean that this appearing world, which only is the world that appears to me, which only is the representation in my consciousness, that this exists, that this is given outside of my consciousness and independent of my consciousness. Kant says the error in thinking is to think that when we have something conditional, so something which does not exist on its own, then with the conditional, the condition is given. So if, for example, I have something that is a composition, then with that something the parts are given, right? If I have a Lego house, then with that house the individual Legos out of which it is built are given. That is something the intellect tells me. But now the error of reason is thinking that therefore the absolute condition, the absolutely unconditioned condition, must also be given. That would, however, be a synthetic judgment. And as Kant shows, we can make synthetic judgments a priori only about our experience. So we can a priori judge what, in general terms, we will experience. But we cannot, with our synthetic judgments a priori, go beyond experience and talk about things that can't possibly be experienced. But that is what we are trying to do here when we are saying something conditioned is given to us, therefore the ultimate, the absolute condition must also be given. No. But it is an analytic judgment, and therefore something that is completely unproblematic, to say something conditioned is given to us, and therefore the regress to the unconditioned is not given as something that, so to say, is already done and completed, but is given to us as a task. If we find something conditioned in the world, that does not mean the unconditional is there, but that means we have the task by our reason given to us to go towards the unconditional, to regress. So in our thinking, in our science, we have the task to go ever further in the world, or to divide the world ever further, as if there was an endpoint, as if there was the smallest indivisible thing which we wanted to reach. But we can be sure that we will never reach it. All of this is further proof of Kant's transcendental idealism and of the ideality of time and space, about which I talked in my lecture on sensuality and on time and space as forms of viewing. If you are a transcendental realist, if you believe time and space to exist independently of you, then you would have to believe of either them being somehow cut off at some point, which makes no sense, or you would have to believe that they go on forever, that they are an existing infinity. And that doesn't really make sense either. But if you go with Kant and realize that they are your forms of viewing, so you have to view everything which appears to you in time and space, then you can say, yes, they are infinite, but not infinite as things in themselves, apart from me, but infinite as my forms of viewing. Meaning, wherever I go, whatever I will view, whatever will appear to me, will always appear to me in time and space. And there will never be an end to that, because that simply is my form of viewing things. So I can never reach an end of time and space, because that would be the same as reaching an end of my viewing. That would be the same as stopping to view and to perceive things completely. But that does not mean that time and space and temporal and spatial objects, therefore, exist apart from me as something infinite. It just means that wherever I go, I will find time and space, because I bring them there, so to say. They are not already there. I bring them wherever I go. Now, while in the mathematical antinomies, both thesis and antithesis are wrong, because the world that appears to us is neither has an end nor is endless. All we can say is that neither an end can ever appear to us, nor can it as an appearance be endless, because we cannot experience that endlessness, and it is only what appears to us, so it does not extend beyond our experience. But all we can say is that our experiencing it, that can potentially go endlessly, or at least that can never reach an end. But just like here, both thesis and antithesis are wrong. When it comes to the dynamical antinomies, Kant says both the thesis and the antithesis can be right. Because in the mathematical antinomies, we are not really seeking a new element. The world as a whole is not really different in quality from the parts of the world, from the objects in the world. And likewise, the smallest indivisible parts of the world are not really different in quality from the things that are made up out of these parts. Reason is here not seeking a completely new element that is completely different from in kind from that which appears to us. It only seeks completeness of that appearance. Either completeness as a sum of all the appearances, the world as a whole, or completeness of its division, completeness of the parts. And that is exactly why Kant says there can be an infinite progress towards the end of the world, or an infinite regress towards the smallest parts of the world. We will never reach the end point of that progress or regress, but we can, so to say, get ever closer towards it. But when it comes to freedom and the necessary, these are not of the same kind as the things that appear to us, but they are of a completely different kind. They are a completely different element that cannot be found in experience at all, that, if at all, can only exist beyond experience, in the supersensual realm. And therefore, we cannot get closer to them, like within that which has a cause. There is not one thing which is caused more and then one thing which is caused less and therefore is closer to freedom. But no, everything that is caused is unfree. And everything that is free is not caused. They are completely different, and there is no progress, no approximation happening here. There's just a sort of gap between them. And here the element that reason seeks, the element of freedom or of necessity, they are both supersensual elements, because reason here wants completeness of nature, completeness of the system of experience. And it says that therefore, in order to be complete, it must somehow have a sort of limitation. But once again, that which limits something cannot itself be a part of that limited something. Like if I say the ocean encloses and limits the land, then the ocean cannot itself be part of the land, because if it was land, then the land would not be limited here at this point. The land would go on further. So if freedom and necessity are to limit experience, if freedom is to give an end to the chain of causality, and if necessity is to give an end to the chain of the contingent, both of them must be not of experience. Both of them must not be appearances. Both of them must be supersensual. But that is precisely why both the thesis and the antithesis could be true, because there is no contradiction in the supersensual and the sensual existing alongside each other, because they exist on, so to say, on different planes. So Kant is saying nothing stops me from thinking that within the appearances, every appearance appears as being caused by another appearance, and therefore not free. But still, beyond the appearances, within the things in themselves, there could still be freedom. And likewise, nothing stops me from thinking that whatever appears to me as being contingent, as being dependent in its existence on something else. But it could still be that outside of what appears to me, amongst the things in themselves, there is something necessary. So let's look at freedom specifically. Kant says that yes, everything that happens in this world must appear as having a cause in this world. That's among the principles of the intellect, and that is therefore also true for our actions. Kant says when a human being does a certain action, it must be possible to name a cause, to seek for a cause, and to maybe find a cause out of which it seems this action had to happen. So think of a criminal. Think of someone committing a murder, for example. Kant would say, we could probably, if we knew enough about the details, we could probably say why he did it, why he murdered. Maybe if we knew his biography, we could say, oh, he had a bad upbringing, he was never loved as a child, he was abused by his parents or neglected by his parents, and then we can see that he got, as a youth, as a teen, he got into the wrong company, he was pulled into crime, into some gangs or whatever, and we can see that he never learned anger management, that he was used to being aggressive and to being provoked easily. And now we can see that his victim did do some actions, that said some words maybe that had to provoke this person. So we can say it is entirely understandable and could not have happened any other way, that he did kill this person in this situation. But, Kant says, still, even when able to explain the murder in that way, and even when that murder made sense to us and appeared to be necessary in that way to us, we would still say, but he should not have murdered. Which implies that he had the freedom to not do it. That despite everything that happened before, despite all of his biography leading him to this point, priming him for this murder, he still ultimately had the possibility of not doing it. And Kant says that, of course, if he had not done it, we could maybe also explain that. We could maybe also find a cause for that. Maybe we could then, when looking back at his biography, say, oh yeah, sure, he had all these bad influences, but there were also some good influences. Maybe his parents abused him, but maybe he had one loving grandmother, and maybe she treated him right, or maybe she was always very faithful and always tried to teach him love thy neighbor, and maybe he remembered that in this situation, and that's what made him stop and not kill that other person. Or maybe, yeah, he was pulled into crime and he had bad influence from his peers, but maybe he was always just sort of dragged along, and maybe he always had some sort of reluctance or bad conscience. Maybe he always held back on the aggression a bit as compared to the others. So again, we could find causes to explain him not committing the murder. But again, the fact that his action appears to be caused, it appears to not come out of nowhere, but to have conditions, does not mean that maybe as a subject in itself, he made a free decision. And here what Kant is saying is that if you just look at nature, if you look, for example, as a natural scientist, then yes, you can always find a cause, and you should even always try to find a cause. I mean, that is what science is about to Kant. That is what all philosophy is about to Kant. Finding causes, finding the conditions to the conditional that we perceive. So, I mean, if we just said, okay, there's freedom, people can do whatever they want, then a lot of our sciences could be thrown away. Then we could not do psychology. Then we could not do sociology. Sciences like this depend on the belief that human actions do have causes that can be understood, that human actions therefore follow certain rules and laws, that human actions therefore can be predicted. But that is just the scientific view, trying to understand nature, so trying to understand the system of what appears to us. But it does not tell us anything about that which does not appear to us, because it is supersensual. And here you hopefully get a sense of how Kant's philosophy of freedom is much more thorough and much deeper than all the superficial talk you nowadays get about free will, whether people say there is free will or there is no free will. Kant says there's both. Or at least there could be both. We could have free will while also appearing as beings that don't have free will. So really, if Kant could live today, and if Kant could hear about the newest discoveries that we made about the brain, I'm absolutely convinced he would not change his position on freedom one bit, because it really does not add anything new to that. He would not say that what we learned about the brain since his time contradicts freedom. In fact, I think he would be quite interested in that, because Kant was very much interested in natural science. And he would probably be quite amazed by how much we found out about the workings of our brain. And he would also say that within natural science, within biology, the scientists are doing the right thing by excluding freedom. Because, as I said earlier, freedom, just like a miracle, would be putting an end to reason, would be putting an end to inquiry, would be saying, okay, we can stop trying to understand this. It just happened the way it happened, and that's all we can say about it. So Kant would say that these scientists, they are absolutely right within their science to try and explain an appearance, that is the action of a human being, as being caused by other appearances. Now, all Kant would say is that apparently since his time, we got better and more detailed with these explanations. In his time, these explanations had to be more psychological and sociological, like maybe we could explain someone's actions as being caused and influenced by his upbringing. And nowadays, nowadays we can look into the brain and explain it by the processes that happened in the brain and that caused certain actions. But still, what we are doing ultimately is explaining an appearance by another appearance. And that is all fine and good as long as we are studying the appearances, which is what natural science does, or what all science apart from metaphysics does. So all empirical science, not just empirical physics or biology, but also empirical psychology or sociology or whatever. But the things in themselves, they are beyond the reach of empirical science. And they are not what appears to us. They could appear as being caused, while in themselves still being uncaused, still being free. However, it is very much necessary to emphasize the could. Kant is not saying that this proves freedom and thereby free will. Like he's also not saying that this proves necessity, that it proves the absolutely necessary and thereby God. He's just saying that it proves that the existence of freedom and of the necessary of God do not contradict what we find in the appearance of nature. So this just proves that freedom and God cannot be disproven empirically. It does not give any proof for them. And not just that, it does not just not give proof for their existence, it does not even give proof for their possibility. This is quite important because you will often hear when someone talks about Kant and about the antinomies, even when some professors talk about it, you will often hear that a result of the antinomies and the solution Kant gives to them is that freedom and God are not proven yet, but at least their possibility is proven. That is, however, wrong. And this is very important to Kant. He stresses that not even their possibility is proven. At most, what is proven is the possibility to think of them without contradiction. But Kant always stresses that just because we can think of something, just because a thought is possible, doesn't mean the object of that thought is possible in reality. We don't know if freedom or if God are possible, or if somehow they contradict themselves. We only know that we can think of them. And that's all. This is important because it means we have no good reason yet to believe. This is important because it means that we have no good reason yet to believe in freedom or in God. Because what Kant is showing is that we don't see why the thesis could not be true along with the antithesis. But the antithesis could be true alone, and the antithesis is enough to explain what we want to explain. It is enough to assume that everything is caused. It is enough to assume that everything is contingent. We don't need freedom or God to explain nature further. In natural science, they don't help us at all. Quite the opposite. If anything, they would hinder our natural science because they would block further inquiry. So, yes, they cannot be disproven, but not only can they not be proven, they cannot even be given a good reason to assume they are true, to believe in them. At least as insofar as speculative reason is concerned. Because, and I will talk about this in later lectures, practical reason, according to Kant, does give us reason to assume that freedom is real and that there is a God. But still, the result of the solution to these two antinomies is important to Kant, because he considers the belief in predeterminism, so the belief that there is no freedom, to be the biggest handicap towards morality. And he considers the belief that there is nothing necessary, only contingent things, to be the biggest handicap to religion or to theology. And since it was shown that both of these theses are not in conflict with the antithesis, that leaves at least the possibility to believe that they are true if we are given a good reason to believe. But that is important, if we are given a good reason, because to Kant, belief should be rational. So I can't just say, oh, okay, God was not disproven, freedom was not disproven, so I can't prove them, but I just choose to believe in them. Because such a belief would only be based on my personal desires. I probably want there to be a God or want to be free because I don't like the thought of, well, being alone in this universe without meaning, or of being predetermined and unfree. But this personal individual wanting it, desiring it to be true, is not a rational reason to assume that it is true, Kant would say. So, no, we are not really allowed by our reason, as long as we only consider speculative reason, to even believe in freedom and God. But since they are not disproven, it is now possible to believe in them if our reason is given a good, well, reason for it. And again, practical reason will provide such a reason, Kant says. So that leads me towards the end of this lecture. What Kant is saying about rational cosmology is more or less the same as what he is saying about rational psychology, and about which I talked in the last lecture on the soul. There I said that rational psychology, according to Kant, can never become pneumatology, that is, teaching of the soul as a spirit. It can never become a doctrine that, through synthetic judgments a priori, teaches us new things. What it can be is a discipline that prevents errors. And in the case of the soul, those were the errors of materialism, which denies the soul, and spiritualism, which thinks that it has proven the soul to be a spirit. Well, here in cosmology, the same is true. Kant says rational cosmology can never become metaphysical cosmology. That would be a doctrine. That would be the doctrine of the world in itself. That would be a science, a metaphysical science that, through synthetic judgments a priori, teaches us about the world in itself. is the world in itself, does it have an end? Does it have indivisible parts? Does it contain freedom? Does it come from something absolutely necessary? We can't answer these things. What rational cosmology can be is once again a science that serves as a discipline, a negative science, preventing us from falling into errors, preventing us from falling into these four antinomies and thinking that we have proven either the thesis or the antithesis. So this field of metaphysics cannot prove that there is freedom or that there is a God, but at least it can disprove all attempts to show that there's no freedom or that there's no God. And therefore, it cannot give a positive fundament to morality or religion, but at least it can shield them against any attempts to tear down their fundament. And what Kant is saying is that as long as we are doing theory, as long as only speculative reason is concerned, it is more reasonable to follow the antithesis. Not dogmatically, not assuming that they are true, but rather as subjective maxims of inquiry. So we should look at the world as if we could go on in the world forever. We should look at the world as if we could divide it into ever smaller parts. We should look at the world as if everything happening in it, including our actions, could be explained through a cause. And we should look at the world as if everything in it was contingent. Because that is how we will get ahead furthest in natural science. Again, if we allow for something like freedom or like miracles, that means allowing for an end of explanation. Like the historian, for example, studying the Bible, could try to find how the Bible was influenced by earlier mythology, how you can find certain words or phrases or stories in the Bible that can be explained from outside sources. But as soon as he allowed for saying, no, the Bible was just revealed by God, well, then his job as a historian would be done. Then he could try to apply for a new job. So it is rational, Kant says, in our empirical inquiries and studies to take as our maxims the antithesis, and as scientists to study the world as if the antithesis were true. But that does not prevent us, if there is a practical reason to believe in the thesis, to believe that the theses are true. At least the two dynamical theses. What Kant says the critique of reason does is preventing on one hand the despotism of empiricism, but on the other hand, and at the same time, the nonsense of unlimited philodoxy. Now, Kant in his own day was more concerned with the latter. In the 18th century in Germany, the rationalistic philosophy of the Leibniz-Wolfian school was waning, and those thinkers believed they could prove the thesis and maybe many other metaphysical claims. And Kant wanted to put an end to that. He wanted to show, no, this is not philosophy, this is just philodoxy. This is not loving wisdom, but opinion. You can come up with all sorts of nonsense, and to your thinking, there is no limit. You can think up all sorts of things, and you can think up arguments for all sorts of things, but you cannot really prove that. But on the other hand, there is that opposing danger of despotic empiricism. And I would say that since Kant days, this has become the bigger danger. In his time, the philodoxical nonsense, the rationalistic dogmatic philosophy might still have had some strengths. But nowadays, it is the other side which is causing problems. Nowadays, we live in an age of despotic empiricism where people will say, I only believe what I can see. I can't experience freedom, I can't experience a necessary being, therefore they don't exist. And that Kant calls despotic. Here, empiricism tries to tell us that we can only hold to be true what can empirically be proven to be true. And that there is no room for faith, for believing in something that goes beyond our possible experience. Now, Kant insists that we ought not to believe in something which contradicts experience. And even when it doesn't contradict experience, we ought not believe in something just because we would like it to be true. No, we need a good, practical, rational reason to believe in it. But still, there must be room, Kant says, for such a belief, and therefore, the despotism of empiricism, just like the nonsense of unlimited rationalism, must both be reined in by a thorough critique of pure reason. And that is why Kant's teaching of the antinomies remains quite important, and why more people should actually study it, including natural scientists. Because today's ideology, and again, I will stress that it is an ideology, and I will die on that hill that it is an ideology, it is not scientific. Today's ideology reduces the human being to a mere lump of cells without any freedom, without any value of his own, just a bunch of chemical processes happening in the brain. And to stress once again, Kant would say that yes, as long as we are doing natural science, we should consider the human being just a lump of cells and just a bunch of chemical processes in the brain. It's perfectly fine to look at the human being like that theoretically. But saying that this is all there is to the human being, and there is only this empirical theoretical view, that is not just theoretically wrong because it cannot be proven, it is morally dangerous and even outrageous. And besides, this is a position that usually disqualifies itself by its sheer arrogance, because these sorts of empiricists who insist that there is only what they can see and who insist that there is no freedom, even when it cannot possibly empirically be disproven, these sorts of materialists and atheists of the fanatical kind, they are usually quite arrogant in their ignorance, and they usually refuse to even engage with other positions because, and once again, this proves that theirs is an ideology and not a scientific position, because they, so to say, a priori rule out anything that is not empirical as being, well, stupid or unscientific or irrational or whatever. So to conclude, in this too, you can say that the chapters on the antinomy are really the core of the critique of pure reason, because here you can really see what Kant's deal is, what his project is about. What Kant cared for is, on the one hand, natural science. He was quite interested in that, probably caused by his upbringing, by the influence of his mother. I talked about this in the lecture on his life. And I will, in later lectures, talk about what Kant said about natural science specifically and how he himself engaged in natural science. And on the other hand, he cared about living a life of decency and righteousness. So he cared about morality. And he saw both of those things he cared about being threatened. On the one hand, natural science he saw threatened by the dogmatic, rationalistic metaphysics of his time, because they, with pure reason, independent of all experience, try to venture beyond nature, beyond experience, and to try to find higher truths. And these truths could contradict experience. They could contradict the natural laws. This rationalistic metaphysics, according to Kant, always is in danger of becoming what in German is called Schwärmerei, so enthusiasm or fanaticism. You can end up thinking up all sorts of things about God, about the life after death, and so on, about miracles. And in the end, this will bring an end to natural science. If you allow for such things as miracles, there is no place for natural science explaining things according to natural laws anymore. Or an example I already talked about several times, the Leibniz-Wolffian metaphysicians would question the applicability of mathematics or of geometry to nature. They would say, yes, sure, in geometry you can divide space and therefore any figure or any line in space, and there's no end to the division. But in reality, there are monads, there are atoms. So in reality, there are smallest indivisible parts, which would mean that what is true for geometry is not necessarily true for the world of experience, which would be very, very harmful to natural science if we believed in that. So that is the one danger. Therefore, it is more reasonable in natural science to stick to empiricism, Kant would say, and to not venture beyond experience. But this empiricism comes with its own danger. Just like rationalism can become enthusiasm, empiricism can become skepticism. The empiricist can end up being skeptical against anything supersensual, so against anything that we can't have empirical knowledge of. He can end up denying freedom or denying God simply because he doesn't experience them. Even though he can't find, just like he can't find empirical proof for them, he can't possibly find in experience a way to disprove them. And this skepticism Kant also found dangerous because it may not endanger natural science and our understanding of the workings of nature, but, and this is something that we can very clearly see in our time, it can threaten morality and religion. And you could say that Kant's whole critical project, and therefore these antinomies and their solution really make up the core of it. Kant's whole critical project is about reining in both rationalism and empiricism. It is about preventing both enthusiasm and skepticism. It is about saving both natural science from this enthusiastic nonsense, as well as morality from the skeptical attack on it. Now, with this, I'm at the end of this lecture. I'm not quite at the end of what Kant says in the Critique of Pure Reason and what he says about the dialectic of reason, because there is one last field left, the field of rational theology dealing with the idea of God. And then it is also left for me to talk about the whole dialectic and about what Kant's conclusion to it is. What reason, if it is dialectical like that, what reason can still do for us. This is what I want to address in the next 2 lectures. My deep thanks be to my supporters: Thomas Doringer, Gernot Klaufen, Benjamin Lehning, Oblomov, Ökobong, Samet Özkilic, Elif Özün, Yasin Özün, Christos Pei, Alexander Reuter, Lisa Rinner, as well as to all others who support me and my aufkläring cause.